There's a lot of interesting history in the greater Western New York region. Some of it we don't even think about. We're going to be talking about that in today's episode of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which, as always, is brought to you by those fine people at Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Menden Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome this week to the State of Greater Western New York Report. We've got a rather interesting discussion that we're going to have today. Really, you're going to be learning something because we're going to be talking to a professor. He's a professor of history at SUNY Geneseo. His name is Justin Behrend. And Justin, tell us, how did you get into the whole idea of being a history professor? That's kind of fascinating. Is that something that you wanted to do ever since you were a little kid, or was it later in life that you discovered that this is really where you ought to be?
Well, first, thank you, Chris, for inviting me here to talk history, which I always enjoy doing. And you're right. I think it came to me as a child. I was one of those kids that kind of gravitated to history books. I remember in particular that I would visit my grandparents' house, and she had a collection of Time Life books on World War II. And as an 8-year-old, I would pull those off the shelves and flip through them and look at the pictures. And so there's something kind of innate that was drew me to history, and I liked it. I ended up studying that as an undergraduate. I was a history major. I actually started as a high school teacher and taught high school for about 5 years, and then decided to go back into school because I really enjoyed the research. So I went and then got a couple master's degrees and then a PhD. And that led me to this new career that I have as a professor at SUNY Geneseo, where I've been at for the last about 17 years.
So tell me, how did you decide what kind of history to specialize in? Were you required to do that when you got your PhD, or was that later on that you figured that out?
I had to do that when I was in my PhD program. I started as a U.S. historian, but I was particularly interested in the history of the South, even though I'm not from the South. But the questions of American politics, American identity, and citizenship and violence are often intensified in the South. And so I had a professor at Cal State Northridge that kind of inspired me to kind of look into that. And then when I went to Northwestern University, I studied under a couple of historians who had been trained in Southern history. And so I started to look at this region in Mississippi and Louisiana called the Natchez District to kind of understand the impact of emancipation and the Civil War, but also the origins of American democracy.
And you actually ended up writing a book about that. It's about the South. Tell us a little bit about that book. Was it the culmination of your PhD research, or was this a line that you started once you had your PhD and you started researching independently?
It was an outgrowth of my dissertation for my PhD. So I wrote a book. It's called Reconstructing Democracy, and I was really interested in thinking about democracy from the perspective of the formerly enslaved people, the freed people. And I argue in there that they created really a grassroots democracy in which local people are involved in politics at a grassroots level. And I looked at county level, I looked at town level, political clubs, and other kind of political associations to show how African Americans took advantage of freedom and wanted to radically change their world away from slavery into some new forms of freedom and equality. I argued too that the violent resistance to Reconstruction to African Americans was rooted in their success in creating this democracy. in the Natchez district.
Now, the book's been out for a while. Have you received any sort of feedback on it? What did people think?
I got some good reviews from other scholars in the field, which I'm very happy about and honored. I also have gotten emails from family members of some of the people I wrote about. I tried to include as many specific names as I could, because I know that particularly genealogical research, particularly in the African American community, is really of interest, and it's hard to trace families back before the Civil War because enslaved people names were not recorded in census records. So I included a lot of those names, and it's always a treat to get follow-ups from family members as I can maybe give them a leads to some other documents so they can more fully tell the story of their ancestors.
So this kind of begs the question that, by the way, if you're watching this live and you want to ask a question, feel free to just type it in the chat or the questions and answers there, and I'll relay it over to Justin. So you're focusing on the South, but you're teaching in Western New York. How do you bridge that gap? Yeah, and I know what you've done recently, so explain how you traveled that road from the South to Western New York when it came to researching slavery.
Yeah, I did my research in graduate school because I thought this was interesting, and I thought these places in the South, in the Deep South, could help me answer the questions. But then when I'm looking for jobs, I was applying to a lot of jobs all across the country. Academic jobs are not easy to find for full time tenured track work. And so I'd actually never heard of SUNY Geneseo prior to seeing the job application. But then I visited it, and I was happy that they offered me the job. My wife and I, we've really enjoyed living in Western New York. We've raised two kids here, but the other connection is that the history of slavery is a national one. I think we all too often think about this as just a Southern story, but slavery was legal across all the 13 colonies. The legacy of slavery and its connections with racism in American history are deep and profound. And I began to see a lot of that, the legacy of slavery, in some ways, even the actual reality of slavery in Western New York. And that's kind of what I've been getting into since I came out. The book came out about 10 years ago now.
Right. The one question that I think a lot of people have is when they think of Western New York, they don't really associate it with slavery because, for one thing, most of the people that came here were pioneers. They couldn't afford slaves, or they could barely afford to bring whatever they had here. But it's true that there were slaves here. So how did you find that out? I mean, it seems like, well, how do you find out anything about the records from, say, the early 1800s in this region? You were able to do that. How did you do that?
Yeah, I'm starting to get into census data a bit more, and the census was established as a constitutional provision that needs to be taken every 10 years. So the first national census is 1790. And you're actually required by the census to enumerate all the people, and particularly enslaved people had to be enumerated because they were counted as three-fifths of person, according to apportionment purposes for the House of Representatives. So it was the obligation of the federal government to go ahead and count all the enslaved people. In that first census of 1790, slavery is still legal in New York State. 21,324 people, according to the census, were enslaved in 1790 in the state of New York, and that was 6% of the population. Not many out here in Western New York, but considerable numbers in the Hudson Valley and New York City region. But even if we jump ahead 10 years later, this area, actually all of Western New York was classified as Ontario County in 1800. There were 33 enslaved people in Ontario County, so in this region. And basically what you had is migrants from places like Maryland and Virginia were moving into this region. Nathaniel Rochester, the founder of the city of Rochester, was a slave owner. He brought enslaved people. Other Marylanders came up, and this was kind of a you mentioned the kind of the pioneers. The pioneers didn't just come west, come from the east, but even those that came from the east, like the Wadsworth family that was very prominent here in Geneseo and Livingston County, they came from Connecticut. Slavery was legal in Connecticut. They brought at least one enslaved person, a woman by the name of Jenny, in the 1790s.
So when we think of slaves, we think of cotton plantations, uh, manual labor like that. So we don't really, what did the slaves do that were here in Western New York in particular, where it doesn't seem to have that same sort of economic base the way the South did?
Right, right. That's a great question. Slavery is a very adaptable institution. This is why it's found in almost all human cultures across the globe. Our reference point often in the United States is a particular form of commercialized agricultural around cotton, sugar. In the colonial era, it'd be indigo. But that's just a kind of a recent manifestation of it. Enslaved people were used in mining. They were used in smaller agriculture, which was basically the case in the northern parts of the North American continent. But there's a lot of domestic labor. Basically, enslaved people are used to free up the time of others, and enslaved people generally generate wealth for their owners. And so that's why historically it's been pretty common. We live now in an era where slavery is illegal across the globe, but that's in the span of human history relatively recent. And this is something I try to bring up with my students and kind of put them in a mindset of what it would be like to grow up in a world where slavery is normative, where that is common. We don't live in that world now, and that's good. And we have a lot of our forebearers to thank for that. But moving to this era of complete freedom or universal freedom took a lot of strenuous effort and work, because that has not been the historical norm.
You mentioned teaching your students. I'm curious, when you talk about the history of slavery going back in ancient times, how do your students react when they find out that, say, the Romans had slaves, and those slaves sometimes had a higher standing, particularly the ones who were like mentors, or they had a higher standing than the people that they were enslaved by?
Yeah, it is a bit of an anomaly. I also like to mention that the word slave is a reference to the Slavic people, because that's where a particular group of people that the Romans liked to enslave back in the ancient Mediterranean realm. To be enslaved is not just to do the drudgery labor. You could be an administrator, you could be a soldier, you could be a skilled craftsman, and we see actually aspects of that even in the American context as well. I think students are even not so much surprised about slavery in ancient Rome and other cultures, but they tend to be surprised that slavery was in New York. I don't think that's a story that really gets emphasized in K through 12 education, or really in our national educational systems.
I think you're absolutely correct by that. But by the way, when did slavery officially end in New York State?
Yeah, so in 1799, New York passed a gradual abolition law to slowly end slavery. Nobody was actually freed in 1799. And then in 1817, they passed another abolition law saying that we're going to finally abolish slavery completely in 10 years. So it wasn't until 1827 that slavery was finally abolished in New York, which is, almost 40 years after the Constitution was established.
Very interesting. We're going to be talking about an exhibit that is just started when we come back from this break. Again, you're listening to the State of Greater Western New York Report. We'll be right back after this message. Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com. Well, welcome back. You're watching the State of Greater Western New York Report. I'm Chris Grossa. With us today is author and historian Dr. Justin Behrend. He is a professor at SUNY Geneseo, and he sort of helped, or I don't actually know what your role is. All I know is that they told me you were the expert to talk to about this new exhibit at the Livingston County Historical Museum. Tell us a little bit about that, what role you played in it, and what people can expect to see.
Right. Yeah. So there's a new
Oops.
slavery, abolitionism, and the Civil War, and at the centerpiece of that of this exhibit is a journal from the Anti-Slavery Society of Livingston County. It is a document that was created in 1837. And the society ran for 2 years, 1837 to 1839. And we think it's also one of the first gifts to the Historical Society, which was formed somewhere in the 1870s. And so Anna Kolacek, the director, kind of reached out to me and thought maybe we should make an exhibit about that. So I did a lot of the work in kind of transcribing the document and providing some historical context for understanding it. And I think it's a really interesting way to kind of showcase this history. We created a digital copy of it on a touchscreen display so that viewers can kind of come and interact with it and see the original. We don't necessarily want people handling the 170-year-old document, but they can actually interact with it digitally and get transcriptions and understand why it was important for certain community members to be a part of an anti-slavery society in the 1830s.
So tell us about looking at that document. I've looked at a lot of old documents. How easy is it to read? I mean, people usually wrote in script or some fancy writing that is harder to read today. Is that what the document looks like?
Yeah, it is. It can be a bit of a challenge. My students today don't really know cursive very well, so they're often bewildered by this kind of writing. But as you can see in the image, the penmanship is actually quite good, and cursive is something that students can pick up on, and lots of older folks like me know about cursive. But the spellings can be a bit of a challenge. And we were doing some discussion with our consultants on transferring this into a digital image. They thought they saw some mistakes in the transcriptions. The word public a couple of times was spelled with a K on the end. And it turns out that was in the original transcript, and so we kept that in because that's what the original document says. But in the document itself, it spells public like we do today, Public. But in other parts, they add a K on the end, which is an archaic spelling of the word public from the older English. And I don't know why they had the different spelling, but that's one of the unique aspects of looking at an old document like this.
You know, you remind me when I look at old newspaper articles, this is going back now to the 1700s, maybe even the early 1800s. The S looks like an F. So
Yes.
it's sometimes you have to realize what it is that you're reading. Now, you did a transcription of this. Is that transcription, let's say, modernized in terms of the language, or do you go with exactly how it was spelled in the original?
We went with how it was exactly spelled, so that this is a traditional practice of historians to replicate exactly the way it would be, including, the absence of punctuation or excessive punctuation that's not necessary, so that somebody reading the transcription would know that that's exactly what the original record had.
Now, you mentioned a an Austin Steward in this exhibit. Tell us a little bit about him.
Give a little bit of background to this exhibit and acknowledge that there was slavery before. And Austin Stewart is a good example of an enslaved person that lived in Western New York. He was born in Virginia and forcibly transported here by his owner. For a time, he lived in Sodus Bay, but he also lived later in Bath. And he actually escaped from slavery about the age of 20 or 21 from slavery in Bath, and then moved to Rochester, the new town of Rochester, where he became a free man, and then spent most of his life as a businessman in Canandaigua. And he wrote about that in his own memoir called 22 Years a Slave and then 40 Years a Freeman. So it's actually a really classic in the genre of slave narratives, and it is from this region. So this idea that slavery is what was a part of this history needs to be known. I think your listeners might also recognize the name of Sojourner Truth, who one of the more famous Black abolitionists, but she was enslaved in New York. Her name before she became free was Isabel Van Wagener, because she was enslaved by a Dutch family. So there's this connections to slavery is important, which also perhaps explains why there's an anti-slavery society that forms a decade after slavery is abolished in New York. The reason why you have an anti-slavery society is probably because not everybody believes in abolition. And so they saw their mission is to spread this idea that abolishing slavery is a good thing.
So that makes me wonder, was this Underground Railroad established prior to the abolition of slavery in New York State, or did it come about afterward?
Yeah, there's not much record of escaped slaves coming to New York prior to 1827, largely because slavery would still be legal and accepted and tolerated. You started to see a lot more Underground Railroad activity in the 1830s, 1840s, and the 1850s. Didn't see a lot in Livingston County just because it's not along a major transportation route. Enslaved people would often find the quickest way to kind of get north, and often those would be through rail lines that become established in the 1840s. And then those who are heading to Canada, they would be interested in destinations in New York that would get them closer to Canada. So you'd see a lot more activity in Buffalo, or even further up north, again, up the Hudson River Valley, Lake Champlain, or even Oswego and Watertown. When you get to Livingston County or Rochester, you'd still have a long ways to go. So it wasn't a major route at all for the Underground Railroad.
So, speaking about destinations, how does one get to the museum where this exhibit is?
So it is in downtown Geneseo on 30 Center Street. But the museum has seasonal hours. It doesn't open until May 1st, and then it runs through the summer and into the early fall from May 1st to October 31st. Open just Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and that's largely because it's mostly a volunteer operation, but it's got a rich number of exhibits relating to the prehistoric era all the way up to the present. It's got some really fascinating aspects of the salt mine, the big tree, various Livingston County people being involved in wars, and it's a great time to take for the family, and then also kind of hang out in downtown Geneseo, which has got a great 19th century charms as an old town itself.
Are you involved in any of the local Geneseo type history, just as more of an amateur or a side hustle, maybe.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit more into that. I mean, one thing, this is not uncommon for historians that take an academic position. They move to an area, and we want to know the history of the community that we're in, and so I'm now working more on this census data. And one of the articles I'm working on is on the 1850 census as the first census to count fugitive slaves. And in the process of looking at these slave records, I uncovered an example of the Underground Railroad in which a woman and her daughter were transported in a box in the back of a cart from Washington, D.C., all the way up to Warsaw. And the reason why that this happened is they were obviously trying to escape slavery, but the individuals who transported them, these brothers who actually lived in the Syracuse region, heard that abolitionists lived in Wyoming County. They heard of the Liberty Party, which was also started in Warsaw, and they were trying to find a place where this mother and her daughter could become free. And so they found their way to Warsaw. And there's some interesting local memoirs that then document this, as well as the census that actually shows this woman, Ann Jones, and her daughter, Elizabeth Jones, um, recognized as Black, but then also born in Virginia. They actually show up in the census records, so I can kind of verify that this happened. It wasn't just a story that was circulated in some people's memoirs.
And the next question, the obvious question is, does some of this, say, research or interest spill over into the Civil War at all? Is that something that you've kind of looked at?
Absolutely. So that's what we want to do with the exhibit. Is basically to kind of show how you move from a community that tolerates slavery or has some enslavers in it to one where they're beginning to challenge slavery in the 1830s, to jump ahead to the 1860s, and you've got a majority of the Livingston County is voting for Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, who's running on an anti-slavery platform. So they're embracing this notion of opposing slavery. And then in this region, some of your listeners may know that there was this famous unit called the Wadsworth Guards, which is part of the 104th New York Regiment. William Wadsworth, was a prominent political figure, very wealthy man. He was contemplating running for governor as a Republican in 1860. He actually did run for governor in 1862 on an emancipationist platform. He was known as an anti-slavery individual. So when advertisements began to go up to join the Wadsworth Guards, and this took place a couple of months after Fort Sumter, that is basically an anti-slavery message. It says, "Come join a group that's going to try to end this institution of slavery." And that's something that General Wadsworth, who became a general, became very committed to. And even during his time in fighting the Civil War, he became more abolitionized, as the phrase was at the time, more in favor of ending slavery immediately.
Well, you'll have to tell me if you ever come across the history of Town Line in Erie County. Uh,
Oh,
an unincorporated entity. I don't know that I've had anybody on this show to talk about it. They were one of the last communities to rejoin the Union after
no.
seceding. So, and it's kind of an interesting story about it's actually there's a lot of question marks about why it seceded in the first place. It could have been a joke, or it could have been that there were a lot of Copperhead Democrats there, but certainly they were embarrassed to talk about it later, and they were so embarrassed that they never officially came back until after World War II. It's an interesting story, but
Yeah, I've heard a little bit about that, and I had a student actually do some research into Buffalo history around the Civil War, and there was actually some riots after the Emancipation Proclamation. Not as violent as in New York City, but again, this picture of the North is being united is also a false one. There were still grave divisions and deep concerns about emancipation, and I think this is partly that part of that story too.
well, Justin, thanks for being here. Thank you all for listening and asking your questions. If you want to be a member of the live audience, go to stateof.greaterwesternewyork.com and you can sign up for free every Thursday morning. You'll get the super secret link, which would allow you to watch this show live every Thursday at noon. And that's the only way you can ask our guests questions. Now, I understand people work, so they can't always see it live. You can go to the same site, see the archive shows there, or like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you will be notified when the show is rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30. That's all we have for this week. Again, Justin, thanks. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all again in the future. Bye for now.
Thank you.
We have this. It's difficult to be a one-man show here, pressing all the buttons and looking at it, and also looking at the camera.
I'm impressed.